The conclave hall on Varith Station had seen bad days before. It had seen the signing of 3 different ceasefire agreements, 2 of which failed within a decade. It had seen species walk out of sessions mid-sentence because they could not agree on water rights for a moon that neither of them actually needed. It had seen a Doreth general throw a data tablet at a Salanti diplomat and start a minor incident that took 4 years to formally resolve, but it had never seen anything like this. The hall was shaped like a bowl, wide at the top, narrowing toward the center floor where speakers stood when they addressed the full body. The walls were pale gray stone quarried from Varith's single continent, smooth and cold to the touch. 11 delegation platforms ringed the upper level, each one decorated in the colors and symbols of its species. The lighting was kept neutral. A compromise reached 100 years ago because 3 different species found different wavelengths physically uncomfortable, and no one had ever agreed on a better solution. Right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the holographic map floating in the center of the hall. It showed the known galaxy, or at least the inhabited portion of it, the cluster of star systems that 11 different species called home 40 years ago. The map had been mostly green. Green meant free space, controlled by one of the conclave species, settled, developed with populations and cities. In history, now almost half the map was red. Red meant Krath. Ambassador Doreth Seleuan stood on the speaker's floor and looked up at the map the way person looks at a flood that has already reached the 2nd floor of their house. He was tall, even for a Doreth, nearly 7 feet, with long arms and a narrow face and eyes the color of old copper. His delegation robes were deep blue with silver at the collar, the formal dress of a species that had once been proud of its formality. He had been proud of many things once. 43%, he said. His voice was steady. He had practiced being steady. It was the most important skill he had developed in the last 20 years, because steadiness was the only thing he had left to offer. 43% of inhabited conclave space has fallen to Krath control in 60 years. In the last decade alone, the advance has accelerated. We are losing ground at a rate of approximately 2 star systems per standard year based on current projections. He stopped. He pressed his long fingers together in front of him, a gesture his people made when they were choosing words carefully based on current projections. He continued, the conclave has between 12 and 15 years before the Krath reach a point of terminal advantage. After that point, mathematical recovery becomes effectively impossible. The hall was quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience listening, the other kind, the kind where a room full of beings who are very intelligent all arrive at the same conclusion at the same moment, and none of them want to be the first to say it. The Krath were going to win. That was what the map said. That was what the numbers said. That was what 60 years of war said in the patient and indifferent language of data. Ambassador Seleuan stepped back from the floor and returned to the Doreth platform. He sat down carefully, like his bones hurt. They did hurt. He was 91 years old and had been doing this job for 30 of those years, and he was tired in a way that sleep did not fix. Velhari Ambassador took the floor next. The Velhari were small beings, barely 4 feet tall, covered in fine silver-gray fur that had evolved to keep them warm on a planet that spent 6 Months of its year in deep winter, they were also historically the most committed pacifists in the conclave. They had gone 4 centuries without building a warship. They had resolved every conflict through negotiation, through trade, through the patient and sometimes maddening process of talking, until both sides ran out of objections. Then the craft had reached Velhari. Space Ambassador Myril she had given up trying to teach non-Velhari how to pronounce her full name, placed both small hands on the speaker's podium and looked up at the map. We built warships, she said, 11 years ago. We had never built warships. We had to hire Dorath engineers to show us how. We built 43 of them in 8 years. She paused. We have 11 left. She stepped back without saying anything else. That was the thing about the craft. They didn't need to be cruel. They didn't need to be dramatic. They just advanced slowly, methodically, system by system, with a patience that felt geological. They would hit a defensive line and press against it, and press against it, and press against it, until the line moved. Then they would follow. They had never, in their entire recorded military history, hurried. They had never, in their entire recorded military history, retreated. The Salanti ambassador spoke for 40 minutes. The Salanti had been fighting the longest. Their border systems were the first to fall 70 years ago, before anyone understood what was happening, before the conclave even had a proper word for the craft. Ambassador Thren was a compact being with dark scales and a voice like gravel in a metal drum, and he stood on the floor and read casualty figures until 3 different translators had to be rotated, because the job of converting that many deaths into other languages wore people down. He read the figures because the conclave needed to hear them. He read them without expression because he had been reading figures like these for 20 years, and at some point you either went numb or you stopped working, and stopping wasn't an option. When he finished, he looked around the hall. We are asking all member species, he said, to contribute maximum available military assets to a unified counteroffensive. We are asking for ships, personnel, resources, and commitment. We are asking because we have no other option. We are asking because the math says we must start pushing back now, or the math closes, and then there are no more sessions of this body, because there is no body left to have sessions. He returned to the Salanti platform. The hall stayed quiet for a long moment. Then one by one the species made their pledges. The Dorath pledged 400 warships, which was nearly everything they had left after 6 decades of attrition. The Velhari pledged their 11 surviving ships and 17 support vessels, and a formal apology that they could not offer more. The Resh pledged 212 ships. The Karath pledged fuel reserves and supply infrastructure. On and on it went, each delegation offering what they could, and the tally was updated on a secondary display beside the main map. And the numbers grew, and every being in the hall knew the numbers were not going to be enough. The Krath had 4,000 ships on the line. The conclave could field perhaps 3,000, and that assumed perfect coordination, which it would not get because it never did. Because 11 species trying to run a combined military operation was like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician had learned a different definition of the beat. The last platform to address the hall was the Human 1. Humanity had joined the conclave 60 years ago, shortly after the Krath first appeared. They were, by conclave standards, young, technologically capable, aggressive. Their development but young, they had not been the first species to encounter the Krath. They had not suffered the deepest losses. Their home system was far enough from the front that they had time the Doreth and Salanti had never had, and they had used that time to build. The human ambassador was a man named Theoduse Wren. He was 61 years old, medium height, gray at the temples. He wore a plain dark suit with no decorations, which was unusual for a formal conclave session, and he had spent the entire session sitting quietly on the human platform with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the map, not the casualty figures, the map. He had been looking at the map for the entire session with the focused expression of a person doing arithmetic. In their head, he walked to the floor. He stood at the podium. He looked around the hall at 11 delegations, each of them tired, each of them carrying the weight of what they had just spent 4 hours saying out loud. The human confederacy, he said, will be contributing 1 vessel to the unified counteroffensive. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the hall when Selwyn talked about the math. That silence had been the silence of shared grief. This silence was something else. Ambassador Myril the Velhari leaned forward on her platform. Her forehead flattened slightly against her face, which was what happened when Velhari were confused and trying not to show it. 1 vessel, she said, 1 vessel. Wren confirmed. The Doreth ambassador's copper eyes had gone very still. Ambassador Wren, I want to be certain I am understanding correctly. You are pledging 1 ship, a single ship, to a counteroffensive that requires 1 ship, Wren said again. His tone was the same, not apologetic, not aggressive. The tone of a person who has said a thing and means it and does not feel the need to adjust it based on the room's reaction. Ambassador Thren of the Salanti spoke from his platform. His gravel voice was carefully controlled. The Salanti delegation would like to register its formal objection to this contribution as inadequate, and you can register whatever you need to, Wren said. The ship is the CNS Bastard's bargain. It will be in your staging system within 6 standard days. He walked back to the human platform and sat down. For a long moment no one spoke, then several delegations spoke at once, and the hall became very loud. The session broke into informal groups within the hour. This was normal. Formal proceedings often dissolved into corridor conversations where the real decisions got made. Delegates from 8 different species clustered in various combinations, trading reactions in low voices, running calculations, trying to work out what had just happened and what it meant. Ambassador Selwyn found Ambassador Wren standing alone near one of the hall's tall windows, looking out at the station's exterior, a sprawl of docked ships and structural gantries, and the cold stars beyond. I need to understand, Selwyn said. He was not being diplomatic. He was too tired for diplomacy. Is this a statement? Are you making a point? Because if humanity has decided to, we're sending the right ship, Wren said. One ship cannot. I know what one ship can and cannot do in a straight fight. Wren glanced at him. We're not planning a straight fight. Selwyn looked at him for a long time. The Cathar have held every line we've ever drawn. We have thrown our best at them for 60 years, and the line has moved in one direction every year, without exception. That's because everyone fights the war the Cathar designed, Ren said. He turned back to the window. We're going to fight a different one. Selwyn wanted to ask more. He had 100 questions, but there was something in Ren's voice, not arrogance. Exactly, something quieter than arrogance that made Selwyn stop. He had been doing this job for 30 years. He had learned in that time to recognize the difference between a person who was confident because they hadn't understood the problem yet, and a person who was confident because they understood it better than anyone else in the room. He wasn't sure which one Ren was. He wasn't sure. He wanted to find out. Back at the human delegation secure communication room, Ren composed a short message to the human admiralty. It said that the session had gone as expected, that the conclave had registered formal objections, and that the bastard's bargain should proceed on its current schedule. He received a response 4 hours later. It said, already moving, ETA to conclave. Staging 5 days, 17 hours, Commander. Marsh sends her regards. She also says to tell you, and I quote, try not to make any promises I have to keep. End quote. Admiralty Dispatch Office. Ren read that twice, then he allowed himself a small smile, which was the most expression he had shown all day. He folded the message and set it aside and looked back at the star map on his room's display, the red and the green, the slow, patient arithmetic of loss. 60 years of one direction. He studied the map for a long time, not with grief, with the focused attention of someone who has been solving a problem in their head for 20 years and has finally gotten permission to use their hands in the conclave's main communication center. The clerk responsible for logging formal military contributions to the counteroffensive updated the unified tally. The entry read, Human Confederacy 1 vessel, Penitent class. Siege engine, CNS Bastard's bargain. She looked at the entry. She looked at the rest of the tally, the hundreds of ships from 11 species, the accumulated military weight of the entire conclave. She looked back at the human entry. She had been a conclave clerk for 12 years and had developed a policy of not having personal opinions about the political decisions she logged. It kept things simpler. She held that policy for about 4 seconds, then she pulled up the Bastard's Bargain's public military file. Because she was curious. Because she was human in the way that bureaucrats are sometimes human when they think no one is looking. The file had almost nothing in it. Hull designation, Penitent class. Crew complement, 847. Commission date, dimensions, the silhouette image that looked like someone had taken a standard warship design and made it angrier and heavier, and then refused to clean it up, and at the bottom, added by the human admiralty 7 years prior, one administrative note. Classification, siege engine status. Active note, do not contact crew. Regarding decommission schedule. Previous contact attempts created a situation. She read the note 3 times. Created a situation. The note did not say what situation. The file did not say what situation. There was no attached report, no incident record, no follow-up documentation, just those 4 words sitting at the bottom of a nearly empty file doing more work than 4 words should reasonably be able to do. She closed the file, she updated her log, and moved on to the next entry, but for the rest of her shift and for some time. After she kept thinking about that note created a situation. She had feeling the particular feeling of someone who has just looked at a door they cannot open and is not entirely sure they want to, that the situation was not the kind that got better when you looked at it more closely. She decided not to look more closely. This, she would later reflect, was the smartest decision she made that entire week. 5 days later, the CNS bastards bargain dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the conclave. Staging system, it was alone. It had traveled alone. It arrived alone. Without escort, without fanfare, without any of the communication protocols that military vessels normally used when entering a system full of Allied ships. The sensor arrays of 4,000 vessels turned toward it at once, and for a moment, just a moment, the unified fleet of 11 civilizations went very quiet, not because the ship fired, not because it did anything aggressive, because it was there, because of the shape of it, because of something in the way it sat in space that the sensor arrays could measure, but that none of the readouts quite had a word for. On the Dorith command ship, Admiral Sarith, who had given the order for more retreats than he could count, looked at the sensor image of the bastard's bargain for a long time. Then he looked at his tactical officer. "Get me a channel to Commander Marsh," he said. His tactical officer opened the channel. There was a pause, then a voice came through, a woman's voice, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who has just set down a coffee cup. "Admiral Sarith," the voice said. "Good to finally be here. Where do you need us?" The staging system was called Hareth's Point, named after a Dorith explorer who had charted it 300 years ago and found nothing worth staying for, no habitable planets, no useful asteroid fields, nothing but a stable star and open space in every direction. Open space was exactly what you needed when you were trying to organize 4,000 warships. Admiral Sarith had spent 6 weeks making Hareth's Point into something that resembled a functioning military operation. 6 weeks of coordination meetings and logistics, arguments and translation delays, and the specific kind of exhaustion that came not from working hard, but from working hard on a problem that didn't fully want to be solved. 11 species, 11 different command structures, 11 different ideas about what a proper formation looked like, what a proper chain of command looked like, what proper coffee looked like, the last one being a genuine source of conflict. On 3 separate occasions, he had gotten it to work. Not perfectly, not even close to perfectly, but it worked in the sense that the ships were where they were supposed to be. The supply lines were flowing, and the officers from different species had stopped openly insulting each other, which was about as much as he had dared hope for. Then the bastard's bargain arrived. It came in at the system's edge, which was standard. It did not use the established entry corridor, which was not standard, but not alarming. The conclave's entry protocols were complex, and a ship traveling alone without a liaison officer might simply not have received the full briefing. What was not standard and what could not be explained by a missing briefing was the sensor data. Sarith looked at the data for a long time. The ship was old, that much was immediately clear. Warships, like most complex machines, showed their age in specific ways: hull, scoring, repair patches, the subtle asymmetries of a vessel that had been rebuilt in sections over decades. The Bastard's Bargain had all of those things. Its hull plating was a patchwork of different generations of material, some of it newer, some of it so old it had developed a specific kind of surface degradation that only happened after decades in deep space. But the age wasn't what held his attention, it was the shape. Human warships were, as a general rule, elegant. They favored long, smooth hull lines, streamlined forms that didn't strictly need to be streamlined in the vacuum of space, but that humans built anyway because humans had an aesthetic preference that their engineers had never quite managed to fully suppress. Sareth had dealt with enough human ships to know what they looked like. They looked purposeful, clean, like a predator that knew what it was doing. The Bastard's Bargain did not look like that. It was angular where it should have been smooth, heavy where it should have been lean. It had external structures that Sareth analysts couldn't immediately identify, not weapon systems, not sensor arrays, not anything in the standard classification guides, things bolted to the hull in places where nothing was normally bolted, things running along the ship's underside in long parallel lines that could have been conduits or could have been something else entirely. What are those structures? Sareth asked his chief analyst, a Dorith named Vareth, who had been studying human military technology for 15 years and was considered one of the foremost experts on it in the conclave. Vareth looked at the sensor data for a long time. I don't know, he said. This was not the answer Sareth had been hoping for. Best guess, Sareth said. Vareth looked at the data again. They look like they might be related to communications or to something that uses similar frequency ranges as communications, but the configuration doesn't match anything in the human military database. Could they be new? No. Vareth paused. Based on the hull integration patterns, those structures have been on that ship for at least 20 years. They are not new. They are older than most of our junior officers. Sareth is considered this. Open a channel, he said. Commander Yeva Marsh was 54 years old. She had commanded the Bastard's Bargain for 19 years. Before that she had served on the ship for 8 years under Commander Elek, who had served under Commander Thors before him. And the line went back like that all the way to the ship's original commission. A chain of command that had been continuous and unbroken in a way that was unusual even by the standards of career military service. The ship kept its crew. People came aboard the Bastard's Bargain as junior officers, and more often than not they stayed, not because they were required to, because the ship had a quality that was difficult to name precisely, something in the way it worked, something in the way the 847 people aboard it functioned as a unit that made leaving feel like the wrong choice. Marsh had been offered command of 3 different ships before she accepted command of the Bastard's Bargain. 2 of them were newer, 1 of them was larger. She had turned all 3 down and waited, and when the command of the Bastard's Bargain opened up, she had taken it without hesitation. She was standing on the forward observation deck when Sareth's channel request came through. The forward observation deck was a small space at the ship's nose, mostly transparent shielding, a few seats, a railing that nobody used because nobody sat down up here. They all just stood and looked out. It was Marsh's preferred place to be when the ship arrived somewhere new. She liked to look at the space before it became familiar. She was looking at the Allied fleet. It was a remarkable sight. 4,000 ships of 11 different designs, arrayed in a formation that had clearly taken tremendous effort to arrange the different hull shapes, the different running light configurations, the quiet, constant motion of ships maintaining their positions. It was the largest military force she had ever seen assembled in one place. She thought about what it had cost to build it, what it had cost to keep it fed and fueled and supplied, the decades of war behind each of those ships, the species they represented, each of them carrying losses that didn't show in a sensor array. She thought about the Krath. She thought about what the Krath had never experienced. She picked up her channel. Admiral Sarethas, she said. Good to finally be here. Where do you need us? The joint briefing was scheduled for the following morning. Sarethas used the intervening time to gather every piece of information the conclave had on the bastard's bargain, which took about 40 minutes because there wasn't much of it. He pulled the Admiralty file, which told him almost nothing. He pulled the public military registry, which told him almost nothing. He sent a formal request through diplomatic channels to the Human Confederacy's Military Affairs Office asking for a full technical briefing on the ship's capabilities. The response came back in 6 hours. Briefing classified. Full disclosure available to Allied commanders on a need-to-know basis as determined by the commanding officer of CNS Bastard's Bargain. Please direct capability inquiries to Commander Marsh directly. Sarethas read this 3 times, then he sent a message to Commander Marsh asking for a pre-briefing technical overview of the ship's weapon systems. Commander Marsh's response was shorter than he expected. She'll show you what she needs to show you tomorrow, Senior Chief Petty Officer. Home CNS Bastard's Bargain. Sarethas stared at the message. He was an admiral. He commanded the largest Allied fleet ever assembled. He had been personally decorated 6 times, though he didn't particularly enjoy thinking about the circumstances of any of those decorations. He was not accustomed to receiving messages from senior chief petty officers. He filed it in the category of things he would address later and moved on. The Krath Advance fleet detected the Bastard's Bargain 40 seconds after it arrived in system. This was known because the conclave had spent considerable resources building signal intercept capability along the Krath border, and those intercepts caught the automated response traffic that moved through Krath communication networks. When their sensors tagged something new, the traffic that came back from the Krath detection systems was analyzed by the conclave's intelligence teams within 2 hours. The analyst who wrote the summary was a Solenti woman named Pret, who had been reading Krath communication intercepts for 11 years and had developed over that time a dry and heavily qualified writing style that expressed nothing more than the data directly supported. Her summary read: Krath Automated Threat Assessment System has logged CNS Bastard's Bargain assessment rating 9.1 out of 10. For reference, no Allied vessel has previously been rated 7.2 by this system. The ship has not fired. The ship has not maneuvered offensively. The ship has performed no action beyond arrival and standard station keeping We do not currently have an explanation for this rating. She included a footnote. For additional context, the Krath Advanced Fleet has reduced its forward movement rate by approximately 30% since the arrival. This is notable. She sent the summary to Admiral Sarethas and then sat at her desk for a while thinking about what a machine built to assess threats saw when it looked at a ship that hadn't done anything yet, and what that said about the ship. She didn't reach a conclusion. She liked the Salenti liaison officer assigned to maintain contact between the Allied command and the human ship was a woman named Farah. She was young for her rank, 32, which was young for Salenti, and she had gotten the assignment because she spoke fluent human standard English, which fewer people did than the Conclave liked to pretend. Her job was to stay in contact with the Bastard's Bargain and report anything relevant to Admiral Sareth's staff. On her first morning, she established a communication link with the ship's bridge and introduced herself to the officer on duty. She filed a brief report noting that the crew had been professional and courteous. On her second morning, she received a transmission from the ship's senior communications officer asking if she needed anything, supplies, data, liaison support. She reported this as an example of the crew's cooperative attitude. On her third morning, she pulled up the ship's external sensor feed, a visual link that showed the Bastard's Bargain's exterior cameras, because she wanted to log what the ship's hull looked like up close for the technical annex of her report. She saw the crew, not all of them, most of the crew were inside doing whatever 847 people did on a warship that wasn't currently in combat. But there were people on the hull in suits working on those unidentified external structures that Verith's team was still trying to classify, moving along the hull with the practiced ease of people who had done this 1,000 times. She watched them work. There was something about the way they moved that she couldn't immediately name. It was efficient, obviously, but it wasn't just that. It was comfortable. They were comfortable on the outside of a warship in a military staging system where the Allied fleet around them had been in a state of sustained tension for 6 weeks. They were having what appeared to be a conversation while they worked. One of them laughed at something. The laugh carried faintly through the suit communications that her feed was picking up at the edge of its range. She filed her report. She wrote, "The crew of CNS Bastard's Bargain appears to be in good spirits. I am choosing to interpret this positively. I'm also choosing not to examine it too closely." She sent the report and went to get something to eat and spent the rest of the afternoon periodically thinking about the crew member who had laughed and what it said about a person that they could laugh like that in that place. Knowing what was coming, she didn't have an answer. Sarethas convened the joint briefing the next morning in the Allied flagship's main conference room. 14 commanders from 7 species sat around a table that had been designed with significant effort to be equitable. Same seat height for all parties, which required adjustable furniture because the Doreth were nearly twice the height of the Velhari, and both of them had opinions about proper for seating. Posture. Commander Marsh arrived with 2 of her officers. One was a tall, thin man she introduced as Lieutenant Commander Dan, her tactical officer. The other was a compact woman with gray-streaked hair she introduced as Senior Chief Petty Officer Home. Sarethas looked at Home. He was fairly certain he had received a message from her. Marsh sat down. She had a coffee she did not offer an explanation for why a senior enlisted person had attended a flagla briefing and no one asked, partly because the question seemed awkward and partly because there was something about Holmes' expression that made the question feel less important than it had seemed a moment before. "I've read everything you sent," Marsh said. She was looking at the holographic map that Saretha's team had prepared, the same map the conclave hall had displayed. The green and the red. The slow story of 60 years told in color. The craft advanced, the attrition rates, the casualty figures, the whole picture. She looked at it the way Saretha's looked at it, not with grief, with focus. "You've been fighting this war the way the Krath want you to fight it," she said. Several commanders stirred. The fresh representative, a broad-shouldered being whose species had been in the war for 40 years, opened his mouth. Marsh continued before he could speak. "That's not a criticism, it's the situation. The Krath advance because they press forward, you hold because you build lines. They press, you hold. They press harder, the line moves. Every year, the line moves. It has never moved the other direction. We are aware of our situation," the Resh representative said. "Good." Marsh set down her coffee. "Then you know what the problem is. The problem isn't that you're outfought. The Salanti have been fighting for 70 years. The Dorath fleet has some of the finest crews in the system. The problem is that you're fighting a responsive war. You react to what they do. You defend, you hold, and the Krath are very, very good at making people defend and hold." She looked around the table. "We're going to stop responding," she said. "We're going to make them respond to us." The room was quiet. Sareth leaned forward. "And the bastards bargain does this alone." It was not quite a question. Marsh picked up her coffee again. "The bastards bargain does the first part alone," she said. "If the first part works, and it will, the rest of the fleet does the second part. And that's when the line starts moving the other direction." She looked at the map. She looked at it the way Sareth had looked at it that morning, and the morning before, and the morning before that, the way you look at a problem that has been unsolvable for so long. You have stopped expecting it to be solved. She looked at it differently than he did. He had looked at that map with the weight of everything it represented. Every loss, every retreat, every system that had gone from green to red while he watched. She looked at it like it was already changing, like the color was already in some version of the near future she could see and he couldn't. Beginning to move. "Show me the Krath supply lines," she said to the room, and the briefing began. The supply line maps were not pretty. Sareth's logistics team had spent the better part of 3 years building a picture of how the Krath fed their advance, how the food, fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts moved from Krath interior space to the front lines. It was hard work. The Krath did not broadcast their logistics. Their supply movements were encrypted, their routes changed on rotating schedules, and getting sensor assets close enough to confirm what was moving and where was dangerous work that had cost the Conclave a significant number of intelligence operatives. The picture they had built was incomplete, but it was the best picture anyone had. Marsh studied it for 40 minutes without speaking. The commanders around the table let her. This had taken some restraint, especially from the Harish representative, who had a cultural tradition of treating silence during meetings as an invitation to fill it. But there was something in the way Marsh looked at the map, the quality of her attention, the way her eyes moved across the data that made speaking feel like the wrong impulse, like interrupting someone in the middle of solving something delicate. Dayan, her tactical officer, stood slightly behind her, and to the left, he was looking at the same data. He had a tablet in his hand, but he wasn't using it. He was just watching her think. Home, the senior chief, had found a corner of the conference room and was sitting in it with her arms folded and her eyes on the door, like her job was to make sure nobody came in unexpectedly. Nobody had asked her to do this. She had simply identified it as the correct thing to be doing. Finally, Marsh straightened. She touched the holographic controls and pulled the map's perspective back, further back, past the front lines, past the contested systems, past the Krath advanced fleet's position. She pulled it back until the view showed deep Krath space. Interior, the part that no Allied vessel had gone near in 60 years. There, she said, the point she indicated was a cluster of systems 400 light years behind the current front, 3 shipyard complexes, she said, all 3 within range of each other's support networks. These are the facilities that repair Krath battle damage. The ships that come off the front line damaged go here. They come back fixed. Without these 3 complexes, the Krath advanced fleet loses its repair capacity. Damaged ships stay damaged. The effective combat strength of their forward force drops by roughly 40% over the course of 6 months. We know about the shipyards, Admiral Sarath said. We have known about them for 20 years. They are 400 light years behind the line, getting a strike force there and back. Strike force, yes, Marsh agreed. Strike force would be detected. It would be intercepted. The Krath keep internal security forces specifically for that scenario. They have practiced running them because every time the Conclave has tried to hit rear assets, it's been with a strike force, and the Krath have gotten good at stopping strike forces. 12. She moved her hand on the holographic controls again. 6 lines appeared on the map, thin lines running from Hareth's Point through the Krath border and deep into Krath interior space. They moved in different directions. They curved and angled in ways that avoided the main Krath patrol routes. A single ship can go where a strike force cannot, she said. 6 different routes to the same destination, passive, running the entire way. The bastard's bargain sensor profile at passive running is she paused. Small Verath, Sarath's chief analyst, who had been sitting at the table listening with the focused attention of someone building a very careful model in their head, said, how small enough? Marsh said. Verath opened his mouth. That answer is going to have to be sufficient, Marsh said, not unkindly. Some of what this ship does is not something I can put in a briefing that 11 different intelligence services are going to read in the next 24 hours. Verath closed his mouth. Harris representative, who had been patient for longer than was comfortable, said, if you reach the shipyards, 1 ship against a defended facility, we're not hitting the facilities directly. Marsh said, we're hitting the supply chains that feed the facilities. She moved the map again. New lines appeared, thinner, more numerous, like roots growing under the ground. The supply arteries that moved raw materials into the Krath shipyard complexes. the fuel lines, the ore transport routes that carried the metals the shipyards needed to build replacement hulls, cut those, she said, and the shipyards stopped working, regardless of how well defended they are. You don't have to destroy a factory if you can cut the road that brings it. Materials. Number 1. Sarath was looking at the map. He was doing arithmetic. He could see it, the elegance of it, the way it worked on paper, but there was a gap between the paper and the reality, even if you reach the supply lines, he said. One ship against the volume of traffic those arteries carry. We're not going to destroy the traffic, Marsh said. We're going to stop it. Silence, she continued. The Krath have been running their supply chains the same way for 60 years. Same routes, same schedules, same protocols. Because they have never had to chain them, no one has ever gotten behind the line and made them change. Their logistics systems are optimized for certainty. They run on the assumption that the routes are safe, the schedules are predictable, the traffic flows without interruption. She looked around the table. Certainty is a system, she said, and systems break when you change one variable they haven't accounted for. She touched the map one more time. One of the major supply arteries went dark, just for a moment. One interdiction point, she said, on a route that feeds 2 of the 3 shipyard complexes. The Krath logistics system will route around it. They'll find the workaround within 48 hours. But while they're rerouting, she touched another point. It went dark. The alternate route goes down to another point dark, and the secondary alternate 3 dark points, 1 artery effectively broken at 3 places simultaneously. Now the shipyards are waiting on materials, she said, and while they're waiting, we're not at the shipyards anymore. She moved the map perspective to a different section of Krath space, a different set of lines. We're here, she said. Communications infrastructure, specifically the relay network that connects Krath High Command to the eastern flank of their advance fleet. The eastern flank runs 11 divisions. Those 11 divisions coordinate their movements based on real-time instructions from High Command. Without that communication link, end quote, they operate independently, Dayan said. He had spoken for the first time. His voice was quiet. 11 divisions making tactical decisions based on what they can locally observe, without coordination, and 11 divisions, Marsh agreed, making different decisions based on different local pictures under the assumption that High Command's last instructions are still current. The Salanti representative, an older man named Thav, not the ambassador Thrin from the conclave session, but his military counterpart, said, "You can hold the communications link down long enough for the divergence to matter. Long enough," Marsh said. "And when the link comes back up and High Command corrects, the drift will be somewhere else," Marsh said. "And the eastern flank will have made 12 decisions that contradict standing orders, and High Command will spend 3 days sorting out which decisions can be undone and which ones created conditions that have to be dealt with first. Number 1, she folded her hands on the table. "The Krath do not fight confused," she said. "They have never fought confused. Their entire military doctrine is built on patience and certainty. They know where they're going, they know how they're getting there, and they move with the confidence of something that has never had a reason to doubt its own plan." She looked at Sarath. where I'm. To give them a reason, she said. Briefing ran for another 3 hours. It covered the specific technical capabilities of the bastards' bargain in enough detail to satisfy most of the commanders present and not enough detail to satisfy any of them fully. Marsh answered some questions directly and deflected others with a patience that was clearly practiced, the patience of someone who had answered these questions before in other rooms and had developed a way of doing it that was honest. Without being complete, the unidentified hull structures it emerged were related to communications, specifically to communications disruption. The bastard's bargain could project a disruption field on specific frequency ranges with a precision that the Conclave's engineers had not previously believed was achievable from a mobile platform. How long it had taken to develop this capability and how it worked at a technical level remained classified. The ship's passive running capability, the quality of its ability to move through space without being detected, was demonstrated by the simple fact that it had traveled from human space to Harith's point alone without escort, without triggering a single Karath border sensor, as confirmed by the Conclave's own intercept records. The Velhari admiral, a being named Soren, who had spent the entire briefing listening with the careful attention of someone who was simultaneously very impressed and very worried, raised a question at the end. This plan, she said, the disruption of the supply lines, the communications interdiction. If it works, and I am genuinely uncertain that it will work, though I acknowledge the reasoning is sound, the Karath will adapt, they will develop new routes. They will rebuild the communication network, they will find the workarounds. Yes, Marsh agreed. So, what does it actually achieve? Marsh was quiet for a moment. Have you ever seen an army lose a war it knew it was going to win? She asked. Soren looked at her. I'm not certain I understand the question. The Karath advance because they know the math works in their favor, Marsh said. Not just tactically, psychologically, they have never reversed. They have never been in a situation where the variables they planned around stopped working the way they expected. They fight with the confidence of certainty, and that confidence is part of what makes them effective. Take away the certainty. She left the sentence open. It sat there in the silence of the conference room. Soren finished it quietly. You make them uncertain. You make them uncertain, Marsh agreed. An uncertain enemy makes mistakes. An uncertain enemy that has never made mistakes before makes bad mistakes because they have no experience recovering from them. Admiral Sarethis looked at the map. He looked at the lines that Marsh had drawn across it. The routes, the supply chains, the communication arteries, all of it laid out in a logic that he understood, that he could follow, that he could see, working in the theoretical space of a holographic display. When do you go? He said 48 hours. Marsh said, we need the time for final calibration. She looked at her coffee, which had gone cold sometime in the previous hour, and for sleep, some of my crew has been running modifications for 6 days straight, and I would like them to get 8 hours before we cross the Karath border. Sarethis nodded slowly. What do we do? He asked. The fleet, while you're operating, hold position. Marsh said, stay here, maintain the formation, maintain the presence. The Karath know you're here. Let them keep watching you, every sensor they have Pointed at this fleet is a sensor. They're not pointing somewhere else. She stood. When we've done what we need to do, she said, you'll know. The Karath advance will stop. It may not stop completely, not right away, but it will slow in ways that don't fit their previous patterns. When you see that, she looked at Sarethas, be ready. That's when the Allied fleet matters. She picked up her cold coffee and her officers fell in beside her and she walked to the door. At the door she stopped. One more thing, she said, and looked back at the room full of commanders from 7 different species, each of them carrying the weight of their losses, each of them sitting with 60 years of retreat written somewhere in their posture. The Karath have never been in the position you've been in. They have never had to defend ground. They have never had to hold a line. They have never had to fight a war. They weren't certain of winning, too, she said. It's simply no drama, no performance. They're not going to like it, she said. Then she left. Senior Chief Home caught up with her in the corridor outside. How'd it go, Home asked. Well enough, Marsh said. Dorothy Admiral kept doing that thing with his hands, that folding thing. He does it when he's processing something he hasn't decided how to feel about yet. Why'd you tell them that was worth processing? Marsh walked beside her, matching her pace the way she had for 15 years. The truth, Marsh said. All of it, enough of it. Home nodded. This was a distinction she understood. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The Allied flagship was large, larger than the Bastards bargained by hull volume, though not by much, and very differently laid out. Marsh always found Allied ships slightly disorienting. The corridors were the right size but the wrong shape, the angles slightly different from what her body expected after 19 years on one vessel. The crew's ready, Holmes said. I know. Petty Officer Vin finished the calibrations on the disruption array. She wants you to know she's confident in it. Tell her I'm glad, Lieutenant. Orr's team has the supply line intercept points per loaded. They can execute within 4 minutes of your order. Close. Quote, good. Holmes glanced at. Sorry. You're not worried? It was not a question. Marsh thought about it anyway. The Karath border, 400 light years of their interior, the shipyards and the supply chains and the communication relays and everything that kept the Karath advance moving the way it had moved for 60 years. No, she said. Why not? Marsh considered this. Because they've never had to deal with us, she said, and we've been thinking about them for a very long time. Home accepted this. She was not a person who needed things explained beyond the point of understanding. They were nearing the docking port where the ship's shuttle was waiting. Through the viewport at the end of the corridor, the Bastards bargain was visible in the distance. Angular, heavy, patched together. Impossibly old. She looks good, Home said. Marsh looked out at the ship. She always does, she said. The Allied fleet's intelligence team spent the night running and rerunning the analysis of the plan Marsh had laid out. They looked for weaknesses. They ran probability models. They consulted each other across species lines in the specific way of people who have had enough of disagreeing and have found in the face of a large enough problem a way to just work. The consensus by morning was that the plan was coherent, that the logic was sound, that the specific capabilities of the Bastards bargain were, if the specifications Marsh's team had provided were accurate, exactly suited to the task she had described. The consensus also noted, in careful language that tried to be diplomatic and only partially succeeded, that the plan required a level of trust in one human warship and one human commander that was historically unprecedented. Admiral Sarethas read the consensus report over breakfast. He thought about Marsh's voice in the briefing, the way she had looked at the map, the particular quality of her certainty, not the certainty of someone who had not thought about the risks, but the certainty of someone who had thought about them thoroughly and had arrived at a position she understood completely. He thought about the Karath threat. Assessment 9.1. A ship that had not fired. A ship that had done nothing except exist. He thought about the administrative note in the Bastards Bargains file. Do not contact crew. Regarding decommission schedule. Previous contact attempts created a situation. He put down the report. He did not file an objection to Commander Marsh's plan. He did something he had not done in a very long time in the middle of a war that had given him very few reasons to do it. He waited, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the hull of the Allied flagship, the Bastards Bargain finished its calibrations and went dark. The Bastards Bargain left Harith's Point at 300 local time on a Tuesday. Nobody saw it go. That was not a figure of speech. The Allied fleet sensor arrays, which were calibrated to detect objects significantly smaller than a warship, did not register the departure. The Karath border sensors, which the Conclave's intelligence teams monitored continuously, showed no spike in activity that would indicate a detection. The ship simply ceased to be in the position it had held for 6 days and was not recorded as having moved. Admiral Sarethas found out it had left when he tried to raise Commander Marsh at 700 and got no response. He sent a communication to the Bastards Bargain's dedicated channel. No response. He sent a second communication on the emergency frequency. No response. He called Farah, the Salanti liaison officer. When did they leave? He said. Farah's voice was careful. I'm not certain they did. The sensor records show. When did they leave? Sarethas said. A pause. The last confirmed visual contact was at approximately 2:45. Farah said, at 3:10. I attempted a routine communication check and received no response. The sensor records from 2:45 onward show the ship in its last known position, which suggests either it is still there or the sensor records were adjusted. Sareth said. Another pause. The sensor records were adjusted. Farah agreed. Sareth sat with this for a moment. The Bastards Bargain had at some point between 2:45 and 3:10 left the staging system without being detected by the Allied fleet sensors and had then retroactively removed itself from the sensor record, leaving behind readings that showed it still in position. The Conclave had not known this was technically possible. Sareth made a note to have a conversation with Commander Marsh about this capability. When she returned, then he made a note to himself that this conversation would require him to figure out how to begin a sentence with, I need you to explain why you altered our sensor records in a way that did not make him sound foolish for not anticipated it. He put the note aside. He did what she had told him to do. He waited. 3 days passed. The Allied fleet held position. The Krath advance front, which had been slowing since the Bastards Bargains, Arrival slowed further, the intercept. Teams monitoring craft communication. Traffic noticed the change not in the content of the messages, which remained encrypted, but in the volume and pattern. The traffic was getting slightly more irregular, which was not how craft traffic normally behaved. Craft communication patterns were extraordinarily regular. They had been regular for as long as the Conclave had been monitoring them, because the craft operated on schedules and the schedules did not deviate. Something was deviating. Pratt, the salient intelligence analyst, wrote a brief note in her log. Day 3, craft eastern flank. Communication volume down 8% from baseline. Pattern irregularity up 12%. No confirmed cause. Monitoring. She did not send this to Sareth yet. It was too small a change to report officially. It could be anything. It could be nothing. She had learned over 11 years not to build narratives out of small changes in data. Small changes happen for small reasons, and large narratives built on them made you look foolish. She kept watching. On Day 4, the change was not small anymore. The first confirmed event happened on Day 4 at 6:30. The Conclave's deep space signal intercept network, a chain of relay stations the Conclave had spent decades quietly building along the edges of craft space, disguised as survey equipment and debris monitors, caught a spike in craft internal traffic, not encrypted, raw, urgent, in the clear. Translation took 6 hours because craft clear channel communication used idioms that the Conclave's translators were still building databases for, but by early afternoon clears throat. Pratt's team had the substance of it. 2 craft supply convoys had disappeared, not destroyed, or at least not obviously destroyed, with no debris field, no distress signals, nothing to indicate a weapons engagement. They had simply stopped transmitting and stopped arriving at their destinations. The convoys had been carrying raw materials to the secondary craft shipyard cluster. The shipyard cluster was now reporting a shortage of specific alloys critical to hull repair operations. The craft logistics network, according to the traffic, was rerouting. Pratt read the translation twice. Then she sent a message to Admiral Sareth that said only. It started. By Day 6, the picture had sharpened considerably. 3 supply arteries to the craft shipyard complexes had been disrupted at multiple points. The craft were rerouting as Marsh had predicted, but the alternate routes were showing problems. 2 delays, shortages, the logistics equivalent of a river being dammed at 3 points. Simultaneously, the shipyard complexes were slowing production. Ships coming off the front line for repair were waiting longer. The repair cycle, which had been one of the craft advanced fleet's most reliable advantages, was getting longer. The craft internal traffic was getting louder, and then on Day 6 at approximately 1400, the eastern flank went quiet. Not completely quiet, but the communication link between craft high command and the eastern flank's 11 divisions, a link that had run continuously for as long as the Conclave had been monitoring it, went intermittent, spotty, unreliable in a way that craft communication had never been. In the Allied Fleet's Intelligence Center, the monitoring teams watched the pattern change in real time. Pratt sat at her desk and watched 11 craft divisions begin making independent decisions. She watched the high command messages to the eastern flank either fail to transmit or Arrive late and disordered, she watched the Eastern Flank's divisions respond to local conditions they could observe. Rather than waiting for orders they could no longer reliably receive, she watched the divergence happen division by division, decision by decision. Small differences in positioning, in timing, in the interpretation of the last successfully received instructions. Each individual decision was logical, reasonable, defensible given what each division could see from where it was standing. They just weren't coordinated. And the craft advance, which had moved with the unified precision of a single large organism for 60 years, began to look for the first time like 11 separate things making 11 separate choices. Sareth was in the intelligence center when the analysis came through. He stood at the main display and watched the Eastern Flank's cohesion break down in slow motion. How long has the link been disrupted? He said. 9 hours confirmed. Pret said, I think it started before we registered it, possibly 12 to 14 hours. Total. Can they restore it? They're trying. The traffic volume from high command's communication infrastructure has increased significantly. They know something is wrong and they're throwing resources at it, but whatever is disrupting the link isn't something they can fix from the inside. Sareth looked at the diverging Eastern Flank. 12 different decisions made without coordination, some of them reversible, some of them creating conditions on the ground that would take days to untangle, regardless of what High Command ordered. Now he thought about what Marsh had said. An uncertain enemy that has never made mistakes before makes bad mistakes because they have no experience recovering from them. He watched the craft Eastern Flank make mistakes, not catastrophic ones. The craft were disciplined, and disciplined forces don't collapse the way undisciplined ones do. But mistakes, small ones, spreading, the kind that, given enough time, compound something else. Pret said. She put a second display up beside the first. It showed signal, a broadcast on craft frequencies inside craft controlled space, which was not where conclave signals normally appeared. The broadcast had started 6 hours ago and was still running. It was being received across 11 systems. Is this from the bastard's bargain? Sareth said. We're certain of it, Pret said. The signal profile matches the communication disruption arrays our analysts identified on the hull. What are they broadcasting? Pret looked at her translation team. A young Harrish analyst named Turn, who had been working on this for the past 4 hours and looked like he had not blinked in approximately 2 of them. It's in Crath, Turn said. High Crath formal register, not translated original language. He paused. Commander Marsh is speaking at herself. The room was quiet. What does it say? Sareth said. Turn looked at his notes. He had written the translation very carefully because he wanted to be certain he was rendering it correctly. She's telling them, he said slowly, what she has done, specifically the supply artery she has cut and where the communication disruption and how long it has been running, the current status of their logistics shortfall. He paused. She's giving them their own numbers, their own projections, updated with the new variables she's introduced. Sareth stared at him. She's telling the enemy what she's done to them, he said, in their own language. Turn said, informal. Crath. High Crath is the register used for significant communications, official statements, military orders at the highest level. Using it as he searched For the right framing, it is not a casual choice, it is a deliberate signal of seriousness. And then what? Sarith said, after she's told them all. Of this, Tern looked at his notes again. She says he paused. Read it again, read it a third time. This is uncomfortable, it is going to become more uncomfortable, you have time to make a different choice. The room was quiet for a long time. Soren the Velhari admiral, who had been sitting in the corner of the intelligence center for the past 2 hours and had not said anything, said she's talking to them. Yes, Sarith said, she's not trying to destroy them, she's not trying to defeat them in a battle. Soren's voice was very careful, she's making an argument. Sarith looked at the display. The supply lines broken at 3 points. The eastern flank drifting, the broadcast going out across 11 craft. Systems in formal high craft, 1 ship. Yes, he said. What kind of people? Soren said. Quietly, not to anyone in particular. More to the question itself, plan for 20 years how to change the mind of an enemy. What kind of people learn the formal register of that enemy's language, and then use it to make an argument in the middle of a war? Nobody answered. The display updated. The Krath eastern flank's forward movement had stopped. Completely. Not slowing, stopped. The 11 divisions that had been advancing, each at slightly different rates and in slightly different directions for the past 6 days, had come to a complete halt. Sir Preth said. Her voice had changed. It had gone to that flat quality that experienced analysts used when they were reporting something they were not sure how to feel about. The eastern flank has stopped advancing. I see it, Sarith said. The northern and central flanks are reducing pace. Not stopping but reducing. Approximately 60% of standard advance rate. And Sarith watched the display. 60 years of movement. He had been in this war for 31 of those years. He had watched the red push the green back, season by season, year by year, with the patience of mathematics. He had given more retreat orders than he could remember. He had stopped trying to count the retreat orders somewhere around year 12 because counting them was not useful and not comfortable. The line was not moving, not forward, not back, not yet. But it had stopped moving forward, and in 60 years it had never done that. His communications officer turned from his station. Sir, I have an incoming message on the priority diplomatic channel. It is addressed to the conclave. High command from. He paused. From the Krath, he said. The room went very still. In 60 years of war, the Krath had not initiated diplomatic contact. They had responded to a few conclave overtures briefly in ways that amounted to no, delivered in formal language, but they had never opened a channel themselves. What does it say? Sarith said. The communications officer. Read it again. It says he stopped, started again. It says they wish to discuss the terms of a temporary cessation of advance operations pending resolution of. He paused. Pending resolution of present operational challenges. The words hung in the intelligence center's recycled air. Present operational challenges, not defeat, not surrender, not a dramatic statement of any kind. The Krath did not do drama. They had never needed it, because the mathematics had always been on their side. But one human ship in their interior, breaking supply lines and disrupting communications and broadcasting informal high craft, that this was uncomfortable and was going to get more uncomfortable. One ship had introduced, for the first time in 60 years, something the craft logistics and psychological systems had no classification for. Doubt. Sarith stood at the display and looked at the word that had just arrived on his communication screen. His tactical officer, a young Doreth named Selvar, who had been born after the war started and had never known a time before it, said, "Sir, what do we do?" Sarith thought about Marsh, about the plan, about what she had said at the end of the briefing. "When you see it, be ready." He looked at the display, the stalled front, the eastern flank motionless, the craft communication systems working overtime to figure out what was happening to them. "We hold our position," he said, "and we wait for Commander Marsh to finish on the bastard's bargain." Deep inside craft space, the crew did not celebrate. They were still working. There was no ceremony to interrupt, no moment of dramatic recognition. Petty Officer Van monitored the disruption, array's output, and made small adjustments to maintain the communication interdiction. Lieutenant Orr's team tracked the supply chain disruption points and assessed where the next intervention would have the most leverage. The navigation team plotted the next leg of the route, calculating around the craft security response that had begun to mobilize as the interior realized something was happening. Marsh stood at the tactical display and watched the data feed from the craft networks. She watched the eastern flank stop. She watched the supply logistics slow. She watched in the pattern of craft communications the particular texture of an organization that has encountered a problem it does not have a template for. She did not feel triumph. Triumph was not what this was. Triumph was for the end of things. This was the middle second broadcast, she said. Dan looked at her. Ready. The second broadcast was shorter than the first. It ran on the same craft frequencies, in the same high craft register. It said, "We have not harmed your people. We have not destroyed your ships. We have made your machinery stop. We can make more of it. Stop, or we can stop doing this entirely. The choice, as with all choices, belongs to the one who makes it." She turned from the display. "Get me a course to the third supply artery," she said, "and tell the crew they have 2 hours of downtime starting now." She walked to her cabin, which was small and plain and had been her cabin for 19 years, and she sat down and looked at the wall for a while. The wall had a map on it, not a holographic one, paper, actual printed paper, which was unusual enough on a warship that several of her crew had asked about it over the years. It was a map of craft space as it had been 20 years ago, when she had pinned it there with lines drawn on it in red marker in her own handwriting. The lines were routes, 6 of them, curved lines running through craft interior space towards specific targets. She had drawn those lines 20 years ago. She looked at them now. They looked exactly like the route she had presented to the conclave admirals in the briefing 3 days ago. 20 years she had drawn this map. 20 years ago she had been running these numbers for 20 years. She had been waiting for 20 years for the moment when someone would say the right combination of words to the right person, and the bastard's bargain would get the order it had been built, shaped, and calibrated to receive. She had not wasted the years. Neither had the ship. She looked at the map for a while longer. Then she got 2 hours of sleep, which was what she had told the crew they were getting, because she believed in leading by example. The Krath withdrawal started on day 11. It was not a rout, it was not a collapse. It was orderly, systematic, and precisely managed in the way that everything the Krath did was orderly, systematic, and precisely managed. They pulled back along the eastern flank. First, the 11 divisions that had been sitting motionless for 5 days, accumulating contradictory standing orders from a high command that was simultaneously trying to fix its communication network, restore its supply chains, locate the source of its problems, and coordinate a military response to something that its planning infrastructure had no pre-established category for. The withdrawal was conducted with dignity. Nobody could take that from them, but they withdrew. The Allied fleet's sensor arrays caught the first movement at 4:11. On day 11, and within 3 hours, the pattern was confirmed: eastern flank. Moving back, not fast, not panicked. Choosing to move deliberately, ceding ground that they had held for years, and doing it on their own terms, but doing it. Preth's night shift team caught it. First, the analyst on duty sent a single-line emergency notification to Admiral Sareth's personal channel that read, "Eastern flank is withdrawing, not a patrol adjustment, full withdrawal." Waking you up now felt appropriate. Sareth was out of bed before the message finished its alert tone. He was in the intelligence center by 4:30. The entire senior staff was there with 20 minutes. Nobody had needed to be summoned more than once. The word had moved through the flagship the way significant words always moved, not through the official communication system, but through the faster, quieter channel of people who had heard something and needed to tell the nearest person immediately. The eastern flank was withdrawing by 600. The northern flank was doing the same, more slowly, more cautiously, in smaller increments, but the direction was the same. Back, for the first time in 60 years back, the central flank held for another 6 hours. It was the strongest sector, the most deeply established, with positions that had been built up over decades. The Krath Central Command was clearly debating the communication. Traffic from that sector was dense and irregular, the pattern of an organization running arguments through its channels faster than the channels were designed for. At 1400 to move back, the Allied fleet's war room was not built for the sound it made when the confirmation came through. The room held beings from 7 different species, and none of them had the same way of expressing the particular feeling of watching something stop that had been happening without pause for their entire professional lives. The Doreth had a vocalization for it, a low, sustained sound that several of them made without appearing to decide to. The Velhari were very still and very bright-eyed. The Harish made a gesture with their hands that meant, in their culture, something close to "I will remember this." Admiral Sareth looked at the display. He looked at the line, the front, the border between green and red, the fixed point around which 60 years of war had organized itself, and he watched it move the other direction just a little. Just the beginning, but the other direction. He stood there for a long time. Selvar, his tactical officer, said something to him. He didn't hear it the first time. Selvar said it again. "What do you want us to do, sir?" Sareth looked at the display. The withdrawing flanks, the slow, orderly retreat of an army that was still dangerous, that was choosing its own pace, that had not broken but had decided, for the first Time that holding this ground was not worth the current cost. Hold, he said. We hold our position. We do not advance. We do not pursue. Selvar looked at him with the expression of someone who has spent their entire career wanting to advance and is finding it difficult to process the instruction. Not to, they're moving back, Selvar said. If we push now while they're in transition, we're not here to destroy them, Sarath said. We're here to make them stop. They're stopping. We hold, he said it quietly. He did not make it an argument. He had the particular tone of a person who has been in a war for 31 years and has learned the difference between winning a battle and ending something. Selvar held. On day 12, the bastards' bargain began its return. It came back the same way it had gone, alone, undetected, moving through craft space in a way that left no sensor record. Fiera, who was still monitoring the bastards' bargain's dedicated channel, received a short communication at 8:15. That said, coming home, ETA 36 hours. We're going to need to restock the coffee supply. Someone's been unreasonable about it, Senior Chief. Home. Fiera read this twice. She decided it was the best news she had received in 3 weeks and filed it accordingly. The bastards' bargain arrived back at Harath's Point at 2000 on day 13. This time the Allied fleet knew it was coming. They were watching for it, and still the ship appeared on their sensors with a quality that suggested it had decided to be visible rather than having been detected, a subtle difference in how sensor contacts normally resolved, but one that Verith noted in his technical log and spent 3 paragraphs being precise about. Marsh came aboard the Allied flagship 4 hours later. She looked the same. Slightly less sleep than was ideal, the kind of calm that comes not from absence of stress but from having moved through stress and come out the other side. Her 2 officers were with her, Day and Quiet, Helm carrying a tablet she was reading as she walked, which was a quality Sarath had begun to think was simply permanent. Sarath met her at the docking bay. He was not the only one. 7 other commanders were there, not all 14 from the original briefing, but the ones who had been in the intelligence center on day 6, who had watched the craft front stop, who had needed to be somewhere when the bastard's bargain came back. He did not make a speech. He was not a speech person. The Doreth had a tradition of formal recognition that he had participated in at appropriate moments. But this did not feel like an appropriate moment for formal recognition. It felt like a moment for something simpler. He said, "It worked." Marsh looked at him. "I know. The eastern flank is withdrawing all 3 sectors by yesterday afternoon. I monitored the traffic from inside. The craft have opened a diplomatic channel. They want to discuss a cessation of advance operations. I heard." He looked at her. "You heard?" He said, "The bastard's bargain has good ears," she said. He decided not to ask what that meant. "What happens now?" he said. Marsh looked past him at the war room's main display, visible through the bay's inner door, the map, the green and the red, the front that was finally, for the first time in 60 years, beginning to move in a direction that meant something different. "No," she said, "you talk to them. The conclave talks to the craft. The diplomatic channel is open because they opened it, which means they want there to be a channel that matters. Use it, and if the talks fail." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Then we go back in," she said. She said it simply. No threat in it, no performance The way you say a thing that is just a fact that doesn't require emphasis, because the emphasis is already built into the sentence. The formal session happened 2 days later. The conclave's diplomatic team, including Ambassador Wren, who had traveled to Hareth's Point, the moment he heard that the craft had opened a channel, met in a secure communication space with a craft delegation speaking from somewhere inside craft territory. Translation: arrays, multiple species observing every precaution that 60 years of failed diplomatic attempts had taught the conclave to take. The craft spoke first. They acknowledged the disruption of their supply lines. They acknowledged the communication interdiction. They acknowledged in the careful language of an organization that did not acknowledge failure that their current operational situation was experiencing variables they wished to resolve before committing to further advance operations. Wren listened. He said, "We understand. We are prepared to discuss conditions for a long-term cessation of hostilities. We believe a sustainable peace serves both of our peoples better than a prolonged conflict." The craft delegation was quiet for a moment. Then they said, "Your vessel, the one that entered our interior, describe its classification." Wren said, "The CNS Bastard's Bargain, Penitent Class Siege Engine." "How many of this class does your military maintain?" Wren looked at the table in front of him for a moment. He said, "Enough." The craft were quiet again. "That is not a number," their representative said. "No," Wren agreed. "It isn't." He said nothing else on the subject. The craft, after a pause that their translators later described as containing a quality they did not have a word for in any language they worked with, moved on to the substance of the ceasefire terms. The talks lasted 9 days. They were not easy. 9 days of detailed argument about territorial lines, about the status of systems that had changed hands, about the specific conditions that would define the cessation and what monitoring would look like and what the consequences of violation would be. The craft were not simple negotiating partners. They were precise and demanding, and they had a definition of acceptable terms that moved slowly, but they were negotiating. That was the thing. They were in the room. They were talking 60 years of war, and they had never once been in the room talking about terms because they had never needed to. The math had always worked in their favor, and they had known it, and they had simply kept advancing. The math had changed. On the 9th day, the talks produced a preliminary agreement, not a final peace that would take years, but a cessation of advance operations, a commitment to continued negotiation, and a mutual withdrawal to lines that both parties agreed were defensible. The systems that had been taken in the last decade remained craft. Everything from before that was returned to negotiation. The future was genuinely unclear, but the advance had stopped. Ambassador Wren signed the preliminary agreement at 1600. On the 9th day, the craft delegation signed it on their end through encrypted communication because they did not come in person and nobody expected them to. Wren sat alone in the communication room. After everyone else had left, he looked at his signed copy of the agreement. He thought about the last 60 years, the slow red tide on the map, the Dora systems that had gone dark, the Velhari admiral who had apologized for only having 11 ships, the casualty figures Thran had read for 40 minutes without Expression because he had run out of expression years ago. He thought about what his counterpart in the human Admiralty had said to him 12 years ago. When this plan was first discussed in its early form, we've been thinking about this problem for a long time. We've built the tools to address it, but there is a right moment for everything. And the right moment is when the rest of the galaxy has tried everything else first and it has not worked. Then they will be ready for a different argument. Then the thing we send will mean what we need it to mean. 12 years ago, Rin had thought at the time that this was extraordinarily patient. Now he thought it was the correct kind of patient. The Allied fleet celebration lasted 3 days. Each species had its own way of marking the end of something bad. The Doreth had formal ceremonies that involved the spoken names of the dead. The Velhari had a quiet communal practice that outsiders were invited to observe but not participate in. Atresh played music at volumes that the other species requested be slightly reduced, and that the Atresh reduced by approximately half of what was requested, which was a compromise. The humans on the Allied fleet had a gathering in the largest common space on the flagship, which involved music of their own and food that they shared with anyone who wanted to try it, and a quality of noise that was various. Observers noted, specifically human, expansive, and overlapping, and somehow both organized and chaotic at the same time. Commander Marsh attended for 2 hours. She ate something someone handed her. She talked with Sareth, who had found a quiet corner and was standing in it looking at the celebration with the expression of a person who is glad it is happening and is also processing something too large to process quickly. She talked with Soren, the Velhari admiral, who thanked her formally and at length in a way that Marsh received with the particular grace of someone who is slightly uncomfortable with formal thanks but understands that the other person needs to give it. She talked with Fira, the Solenti liaison officer, who asked her a question. Did you know it would work? Fira said. Before you went. Were you certain? Marsh thought about this honestly. I was certain the plan was sound, she said. I was certain the ship could execute it. I was certain we had analyzed the craft's vulnerabilities correctly. She paused. Whether that adds up to certain, I don't know. There's always a variable you didn't account for. But there wasn't, Fira said. This time. Marsh agreed. Farah looked at her. She was trying to work something out. Marsh could see it. The way you can see someone trying to find the right way to ask a thing they've been thinking about for a while. The Conclave sent everything they had. Farah said every ship, every crew, everything, and then humans sent one ship. She paused. Was that arrogance? Did you think the rest of us had failed because we were doing it wrong? Marsh shook her head. You didn't fail, she said. You fought a war the way a war looks when you're in it and you're trying to survive it. You defended, you held, you kept your people alive as long as you could. That's not failure, that's what you do when someone attacks you. Then what did you do differently? We had time, Marsh said. We weren't on the front. We weren't defending our home systems. We had time to think about the problem from the outside, to build something specific for it, to wait for the right moment to use it. She looked across the room. Distance is a resource we used hours. Farah thought about this, and now she said, what happens to the bastard's bargain? Now Marsh looked at her. She goes home. She said, Get some work done on the hull plating. On the port side, it's been needing attention for 8 months. There just hasn't been a good window. We restock, we recalibrate. We rest and then. Marsh picked up a glass of something one of the human crew had handed her. She looked at it, then. We wait, she said, and hope the talking works. And if it doesn't, she looked at Farah. We've done this before, she said. We know how. 3 weeks later, the Dorth ambassador sent a formal inquiry to the human admiralty. It was the inquiry that 6 other conclave ambassadors had been wanting to send since the ceasefire and had been arguing amongst themselves about who should send it. Selouan had sent it in the end, partly because he was the senior conclave ambassador and partly because he was the one who had been in the war the longest and felt he had earned the right to ask the question that everyone was afraid to ask. The inquiry was 3 pages of formal diplomatic language that could be summarized as how many ships like the Bastard's Bargain does humanity have? The human admiralty's response took 48 hours. It came back in standard diplomatic format, proper header, official seal, the correct response code for interconclave military inquiries. 1 line enough, Ambassador Selouan. Read the word. He read it again. He had expected a number. He had expected a number he might find alarming or reassuring or both. He had prepared himself for a number, numbers he knew how to handle. Numbers could be evaluated, compared, assessed against other numbers, placed in context. Enough was not a number. Enough was an answer that contained a number and refused to give it to you. Enough was the kind of answer that a person gives when they have thought very carefully about what the question is really asking beneath the question and have decided to answer that instead. He sent the response to Sorin. Sorin forwarded it to Thuv. Thuv forwarded it to 6 other officers. Within 12 hours, every military commander in the conclave who had been at Herath's point had seen the word. They sat with it. They sat with it the way you sit with something that doesn't resolve, that stays open, that keeps doing its work even after you've put it down, that reaches back and finds you in quiet moments when you're thinking about other things. Sarath read it in his office on the flagship, which was still at Herath's point pending final stand-down orders. He looked out the viewport at the space where the Bastard's Bargain had sat for 6 days before it left without his sensors knowing. He thought about the ship, about its hull, patched and heavy and old, about the crew of 847 people who had laughed at something on the hull while the rest of the galaxy tensed around them, about Commander Marsh's voice unhurried, the quality of someone who had been thinking about a problem for 20 years and had simply been waiting for the moment to work on it. He thought about the word enough. He thought about what it meant for a species to look at a war that had been running for 60 years and say, we've been thinking about this. We've been building for this. We've been waiting. He thought about the gap, the distance between what humanity had done and what humanity had not done. 1 ship. 1. Not because that was all they had. Because that was what the situation called for, because that was what enough meant. Sorin's voice came through his communication line. She had been quiet since the ceasefire, processing things in the careful Hari way. Have you read the Admiralty's response? She said. Yes, Sarath said. What do you make of it? He looked out the viewport, the cold stars, the space where the bastard's bargain had been and then had not been, and then had been. Again, I think, he said slowly, that humanity has been very patient with us. Soren was quiet for a moment. Meaning they had this, they've had this for a long time, a plan, ship, a capability. And they waited. They waited until we had tried everything we could try, and it had not worked, and then they sent the thing they'd built, and it worked, and they sent it alone. He paused. They sent it alone because they were making a point. What point? He looked at the word enough on his display, that this was proportionate, he said. That one ship was the correct response. That they looked at 60 years of war and said this situation calls for one ship. And we have built ships for situations that would call for more. The line was quiet, and we don't know how many more. Soren said, no. Sareth said, we don't. Oh, another silence. Is that frightening? Soren asked. Sareth thought about it. He thought about the war, about the Krath withdrawing, about the ceasefire talks, about the front that had moved for the first time in a direction that meant the future might look different from the past. No, he said. He meant it. No, it's the most reassuring thing I've heard in 31 years. He closed the communication. He looked at the display, the map still mostly red, but the line had moved just a little. Just the beginning of something that was going to take years to resolve, to rebuild, to negotiate into a shape that everyone could live with. But the line had moved for the first time the other direction. He sat back in his chair and let himself feel it, the specific feeling of a thing that has been pulling against you for your entire life. Finally, beginning to give. Outside, somewhere in the void between stars, the bastard's bargain was already home, already resting, already waiting. Enough.